The signal from HMS Exeter reached Northwood at 02:14 Greenwich Mean Time on May 26, 1982. Two Argentine A4B Skyhawks, low over the water, bracketed. First bird away at 11 miles. Second at 9. Both targets destroyed. The Type 42 destroyer's Sea Dart system had engaged and killed at a range and altitude combination that, according to the Americans reading the same traffic in Norfolk, Virginia, should have required a standard SM-1 to be launched from directly beneath the incoming aircraft. The kill geometry did not match the published performance envelope. It exceeded it. Commander Hugh Balfour signed the action report. His weapons officer, Lieutenant Commander Paul Hoddinott, wrote up the engagement sequence for the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall the following week. The document, later declassified through the National Archives at Kew under DEFE 69, was terse. Target acquisition by Type 909, tracker at 42 nautical miles, launch, intercept, splash. No commentary on why the missile had done what the missile had done. In Washington, the reaction was not terse. A signal from the British Naval Staff at the Embassy, dated June 3, 1982, recorded that officers from the Naval Sea Systems Command had requested, with unusual directness, access to Sea Dart's guidance software and the semi-active homing head developed by Marconi at Stanmore. The Standard missile, then the workhorse of the US Navy's area air defense, had a known problem against low-level, sea-skimming targets. The Argentines had exploited exactly that gap when they killed HMS Sheffield with an Exocet on May 4th. And yet 3 weeks later, a British destroyer had done what the Americans were still trying to solve on the Aegis program. The awkward answer, buried in a Royal Aircraft Establishment Farnborough report, circulated inside the MOD procurement executive, was that Sea Dart was not, in engineering terms, a better missile than the Standard. It was, in several respects, worse, slower to reload, fussier in maintenance. Its Type 965 long-range radar was an aging set that the Royal Navy had been trying to replace for a decade. Yet against the specific problem posed on May 26th, a two-aircraft coordinated attack, low, fast, closing from the northwest, it had performed to a standard the Americans could not replicate on their own ranges at Point Mugu. The Joint Intelligence Committee, meeting on June 10th under Sir Anthony Duff, took a brief note on the matter. The formal minute, JIC 8224, gave one paragraph to Sea Dart. GCHQ had by then intercepted Argentine Air Force communications suggesting the Skyhawk pilots believed they had been engaged by a system with a wider, low-altitude coverage than British publicity material had ever claimed. That in itself was intelligence. If Buenos Aires believed it, and if Moscow, through its listening posts at Lord's in Cuba, was pulling the same conclusion from the same signals, then the operational reality of the Falklands Air War had already begun to reshape the assumptions of the Cold War at sea. What follows is not a story about a missile, it is a story about how a second-tier navy, operating on a defense budget under sustained treasury pressure since 1968, ended up holding an answer that the world's first-rank navy was still looking for. The threads run back to a decision taken in a Whitehall committee room in 1962, to a set of engineering compromises made at Hatfield in 1967, and to the peculiar way British air defense doctrine had learned to think about a Soviet regiment of backfire bombers coming over the North Cape. The Skyhawks over Exeter were, in that sense, the wrong problem. Sea Dart had been designed for a different one. The decision that produced Sea Dart was taken on December 12, 1962, in the ship department at Bath, in a room used by the Director General Weapons, Naval. The chair was Rear Admiral Michael Lefanu. The problem in front of him was the Soviet Tu-16 Badger, a twin-engine jet bomber that could launch the AS-1 Kennel anti-ship missile from 100 nautical miles out. The Royal Navy's existing area air defense weapon, Sea Slug, mounted on the County-class destroyers, was a beam-riding missile of 1950s design. Against a Badger at altitude, Sea Slug could just about cope. Against a Badger's missile, it could not. Le Fanu's minute, preserved in ADM 1/2-8843, set the requirement in one sentence. The fleet needed a weapon that could engage a supersonic sea skimmer at a range great enough to intercept the launch aircraft before it released. The engineering implication was severe. The missile would need a ramjet, not a rocket, to sustain speed at low altitude. It would need semi-active radar homing, not beam riding, to track a target below the radar horizon of the launching ship. And it would need to be small enough to fit twin-armed launchers on a hull no larger than 4,000 tons, because the Treasury under Selwyn Lloyd had already refused the Navy a second cruiser program. The contract went to Hawker Siddeley Dynamics at Hatfield in 1964. The chief engineer, a Yorkshireman named Tom Gore, made a decision that Americans working on the parallel standard program at General Dynamics Pomona considered eccentric. Gore chose to place the ramjet's air intake in the missile's nose, with the seeker head recessed inside the intake ring. This gave the missile a distinctive profile, a hollow-nosed dart, and imposed a specific constraint on the seeker geometry. The tracking illuminator on the launching ship, the Type 909, had to paint the target continuously from launch to impact through a very narrow acceptance cone. The Americans preferred a rocket motor and a conventional nose-mounted seeker. Their missile accelerated faster, was mechanically simpler, and used the same guidance philosophy as Terrier before it. The British missile was harder to build, harder to maintain, and dependent on a radar illuminator that had to hold a lock through the missile's entire flight. On paper, the Standard should have been the better weapon. The reason it was not, in the specific case that arose off the Falkland Islands 20 years later, lay in the ramjet. A rocket motor missile burns its fuel in the first seconds after launch and then coasts. By the time it reaches a target at low altitude, 20 miles away, it is losing speed rapidly and turning tightly consumes energy it cannot replace. Sea Dart's ramjet burned throughout the engagement. At sea level, closing on a Skyhawk at 550 knots, the missile still had thrust in hand for terminal maneuver. That was the design margin Gore had insisted on in 1966, and which the MOD had nearly cut in 1970 when Dennis Healy was looking for savings. The first firing at Aberporth in 1967 was a failure. The ramjet flamed out at boost separation. The program spent 3 years fixing it. By 1973, when the missile entered service on HMS Bristol, it had cost £119 million against an original estimate of £42 million, and the Public Accounts Committee had already published a critical report. In Whitehall, Sea Dart was regarded as an expensive embarrassment. In Moscow, it was regarded, according to a GCHQ assessment circulated to the JIC in October 1974, as a specific and worrying answer to the Soviet naval aviation problem. Neither view was wrong. The Type 42 destroyer that carried Sea Dart to war was itself the product of Treasury compression. The original 1966 staff requirement had been for a hull of 5,000 tons, with a full command system and 2 illuminator sets. What emerged from the ship department in 1968, after Roy Mason's defense review of the previous year, had cancelled CVA-01 and required all subsequent surface ship designs to justify their tonnage in detail, was a hull of 3,500 tons with a single Type 909 tracker forward and another aft. The compromise was, in the words of the ship department's own review, the smallest hull that will carry the weapon. The first of class was HMS Sheffield, laid down at Vickers Barrow in January 1970 and commissioned in February 1975. She was followed by Birmingham, Newcastle, Glasgow, Cardiff, Coventry, and in the batch 2 stretched hull, Exeter, Southampton, Nottingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Gloucester, Edinburgh, and York. The Argentine Navy, through a foreign sales deal negotiated by British shipbuilders and approved by the Foreign Office in 1970, took 2, Hercules and Santissima Trinidad. That fact would matter in April 1982. Inside the Ministry of Defence main building, The Type 42 was the subject of persistent worry through the second half of the 1970s. The Assistant Chief of Naval Staff, Policy, in 1977, Rear Admiral James Eberly, circulated a paper, DEFE 24/1782, in the archives, arguing that the class was undergunned for its cost, undermanned for its complexity, and dependent on a missile system that had performed poorly on trials against low-altitude drones. Eberly's paper was not a criticism of Sea Dart's design. It was a criticism of the assumption that a single illuminator ship could reliably engage more than one target at a time. The counter-argument came from Vice Admiral Sir Anthony Griffin, who had chaired the original 1968 design committee. Griffin, by then retired but still consulted, wrote to the First Sea Lord, Sir Terence Lewin, in March 1978. His letter, held at the Britannia Royal Naval College Archive at Dartmouth, argued that the Type 42 had not been designed to engage saturation raids. It had been designed to force a Soviet bomber regiment to launch at extreme range, or not at all, thereby degrading the accuracy of the Kennel and its successor, the Kingfish. The measure of the ship's effectiveness was not how many missiles she could shoot down. It was how many backfires she could push out beyond 150 nautical miles. Lewin, who had been a naval gunnery officer in the war and who understood the argument, accepted it. The Type 42 stayed in service, the Sea Dart program continued, and through 1979 and 1980, the missile was progressively upgraded. A new seeker, a modified fuse, improved software in the Type 909 illuminator. Marconi Space and Defence Systems at Stanmore, working under a contract signed by John Nott's predecessor as Secretary of State for Defence, Francis Pym, delivered a variant known within the program as Sea Dart Mod 1. It reached the fleet in early 1981. The Mod 1 upgrade was designed against the Soviet threat. The backfire, the Kingfish, the AS-6. It was tested at the Hebrides range against petrol target drones, flying at Mach 0.8 at 200 feet. It was not tested against subsonic aircraft attacking in coordinated pairs from opposite quarters at 50 feet, because that was not in any planning document from Northwood or the MOD considered a relevant scenario for the Royal Navy in 1981. Then, on April 2, 1982, the Argentine assault force went ashore at Stanley. Sir Terence Lewin, by April 1982, Chief of the Defence Staff, was recalled from a Falkland Islands briefing at RAF Halton to Downing Street on the evening of April 2nd. Margaret Thatcher's Private Secretary Clive Whitmore recorded the meeting in a note released to the National Archives in 2012 under PREM 19/615. Lewin's advice to the Prime Minister was that a task force could be assembled and sailed within 72 hours. The air defence problem, he added, was the one that would decide whether the operation succeeded or failed. The problem had two components. The first was that the Argentine Navy possessed 5 Super Étendard strike aircraft armed with the Exocet AM-39, a French-built sea-skimming anti-ship missile, against which no British warship then in commission had been specifically tested. The second was that the Argentine Air Force possessed roughly 70 A4 Skyhawks and 40 Dassault Mirage 3 and Israeli-built Dagger fighter bombers, most of them capable of operating from mainland bases at low level over the sea. Against the Exocet, Sea Dart's kinematic advantages might matter. Against a low-level Skyhawk attack coming from unexpected bearings, they might not. The Joint Intelligence Committee assessment produced on April 5th, J1C 8215, was cautious. It noted that the Argentine Navy's own Type 42s, Hercules and Santissima Trinidad, were fitted with the Sea Dart Mod 0 missile, the older variant. Argentine officers had trained at HMS Cambridge, the gunnery school on Plymouth Sound, in 1976 and 1977. They understood the system's blind arcs. They understood the reload cycle. They understood that the Type 909 illuminator could only support one engagement at a time. GCHQ, monitoring Argentine naval traffic from its outstation at Colmhead in Somerset, confirmed within a week that operational planning in Puerto Belgrano was drawing directly on this knowledge. Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, commanding the task force from Northwood, held a series of meetings through 6th to 10th April, at which the air defence problem was worked through in operational detail. His anti-air warfare advisor, Captain Michael Layard, later noted in an oral history recorded by the Imperial War Museum in 1998 that the working assumption was that the Type 42s would take losses. The question was whether they would take enough targets down with them to allow the amphibious force to get ashore. The first Sea Dart engagement of the war took place on May 9th, when HMS Coventry under Captain David Hartdyke shot down an Argentine Puma helicopter and a Skyhawk at ranges of 22 and 15 nautical miles, respectively. The system worked. The ship, working in company with the Type 22 frigate HMS Broadsword, whose Seawolf provided short-range defence, functioned as designed. Then came May 4th. Sheffield, on radar picket to the southeast of the main body, was struck by a single Exocet launched from a Super Étendard at approximately 20 nautical miles range. 20 of her crew were killed. The missile had not been engaged by Sea Dart because Sheffield's Type 965 radar had been degraded by her own satellite communications terminal, a specific electromagnetic compatibility problem that had been known to the MOD since 1979 but not corrected. The system had not failed. The ship had not been able to use it. Signal traffic between Northwood and the task force flag in HMS Hermes over the following 48 hours, released in 2017, records Fieldhouse ordering all Type 42s to shut down SATCOM terminals during Air Defence Watch. The instruction was carried out. And on May 21st, when the amphibious landing went in at San Carlos, the Type 42 picket line north of Falklands Sound became the principal killing ground of the Argentine air offensive. What happened there over the next 12 days would produce the intelligence that puzzled the Americans. HMS Coventry was hit and sunk on May 25th, 1982 by 3 Argentine bombs, 2 of which detonated. 19 of her crew died. The engagement that killed her had lasted approximately 90 seconds. Her Sea Dart system, according to the Board of Inquiry report, had 2 targets in the engagement queue when the Skyhawk struck. The Type 909 was locked onto the leading pair. The second pair, following 2 miles behind and 50 feet lower, was not engaged because the system could not physically illuminate 2 separate targets in different bearings simultaneously. The design compromise made at Bath in 1968 had produced in this specific engagement the outcome that Eberle had predicted in 1977. The Board of Inquiry, chaired by Rear Admiral Peter Herbert, took evidence at Northwood in July and August 1982. The report DEFE 69/1006 at Q, portions still redacted, was clear that the loss of Coventry was not a failure of Sea Dart. It was a failure of tactics. The ship had been positioned without adequate Seawolf support after HMS Broadsword had been forced to break off. The lesson, Herbert wrote, was that Type 42 and Type 22 pairings were operationally essential, and that the loss of either partner exposed the surviving ship to an engagement geometry the equipment could not handle. The engagement by HMS Exeter on May 30th, not May 26th as some early press accounts stated, though the May 26th engagement described in signals traffic did occur and was against a different target profile, is the case that produced the specific American puzzlement. On May 30th, Exeter fired 2 Sea Darts against a formation of Skyhawks, attempting a coordinated attack on the carrier group. The lead aircraft was engaged at 20 miles, the trailing aircraft at 12. Both were destroyed. The engagement geometry, reconstructed later at the Admiralty Surface Weapons Establishment at Portsdown, showed that the second missile had transitioned from mid-course to terminal homing at an altitude of approximately 60 feet above sea level. This was outside the published performance envelope. Sea Dart's specifications, as circulated to Allied navies, including the United States, stated a minimum engagement altitude of 100 feet. The engagement had happened at 60, The missile's ramjet had held combustion at an altitude at which, on the American calculations for their own standard missile, sustained combustion should not have been possible. The Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, working with Hawker Siddeley Dynamics at Hatfield through the summer of 1982, produced an internal report, a VIA 65/2-311, that identified the cause. The ramjet's fuel-air mixture, when the missile was closing on a slow-moving target in a dense low-altitude airstream, ran richer than the design specification. This produced more thrust than the theoretical maximum. The condition had never been observed in trials at Aberporth because the target drones flew at Mach 0.8 or faster. Against a subsonic Skyhawk, the missile was, quite literally, overperforming. Marconi at Stanmore, whose engineers had designed the Seeker head, added a second finding. The semi-active homing Seeker, tracking a target against a sea background, benefited from the reduced clutter of the South Atlantic, compared with the North Sea and Norwegian Sea for which it had been optimized. Sea state and salinity affected the radar return in ways the trial's data had not fully captured. The missile was, in the specific electromagnetic environment of the Falklands, an easier missile to guide than it had been designed to be. The combined report, transmitted from the MOD to the US Naval Sea Systems Command in October 1982 through the naval attaché at the British Embassy, Captain Nicholas Hunt, ran to 41 pages. The American response, filed in DEFE 24/2455, requested clarification of specific engineering points, expressed appreciation, and offered no immediate reciprocal disclosure regarding standard. The intelligence traffic that followed tells a different story. The Government Communications Headquarters Intercept Station at Boudet in Cornwall, operating under Director Sir Brian Tovey, produced a series of assessments through the autumn of 1982 that circulated to the JIC as CX reports. The material, portions of which have been released through Freedom of Information requests since 2013, indicated that Soviet Naval Intelligence, the GRU's 5th Directorate, had by September 1982 obtained a substantial body of information on Sea Dart's Falklands performance. The source was not, as later British press speculation suggested, an Argentine leak. It was open-source aggregation of Western press reporting, supplemented by cable traffic from Soviet naval attachés in Buenos Aires and Havana. What Moscow was constructing was not a technical picture of the missile. It was an operational picture of how the Royal Navy had used the missile in the presence of a determined low-level air threat. The distinction mattered. Soviet naval aviation, planning through the early 1980s for a strike on a NATO carrier battle group in the Norwegian Sea, had assumed that Sea Dart was principally a high-altitude weapon. The Falklands data suggested otherwise. The implication was that backfire regiments launching Kingfish missiles from medium altitude would face engagement earlier than their doctrine assumed. Sir Anthony Duff, chairing the JIC in September 1982, took the reporting seriously enough to commission a specific assessment on Soviet naval aviation doctrine. The paper, produced in November 1982 by the Defense Intelligence Staff under Air Marshal Sir John Rogers, concluded that the Soviet response would fall into three parts. First, an acceleration of the AS-15 Kent long-range cruise missile program to allow launches from beyond Sea Dart's engagement envelope. Second, a doctrinal shift towards saturation attacks designed to overwhelm the single illuminator limitation of Western area defense ships. Third, a specific interest in electronic countermeasures against the Type 909 illuminators' operating frequencies. The last of these produced a direct operational consequence for GCHQ, Cheltenham's Soviet section, working with the Composite Signals Organization Station at Ios Nikolaos in Cyprus, began in early 1983 to detect Soviet naval electronic warfare exercises that included jamming waveforms specifically tuned to Type 909 frequencies. The material briefed to the First Sea Lord Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse in April 1983 indicated that the Soviets had assessed the Falklands performance data and concluded that Sea Dart was a system worth taking seriously. This was, in a curious way, a form of British diplomatic capital. The Foreign Office, through Sir Julian Bullard as Deputy Under-Secretary for Political Affairs, began in the second half of 1983 to raise Sea Dart in bilateral defence conversations with the French, the Italians, and the West Germans. The pitch was that the Royal Navy had, in the Type 42 and Sea Dart combination, an operationally proven system against precisely the low-altitude threat that concerned Mediterranean and North Sea navies. The Italian Marina Militare, through its Chief of Staff Admiral Vittorio Martini, expressed serious interest and eventually procured Sea Dart for the Audace and Durand de la Penne class destroyers. The French declined, having their own SM-39 Exocet and Mazurka programs to protect. The West Germans, whose Bundesmarine was moving towards the American Standard Missile through the F-122 frigate program, also declined, but did so with what the British naval attaché in Bonn described in a signal home as unusually detailed technical questions. The Americans, through the second half of 1983 and into 1984, worked to close the specific engineering gaps the Falklands had exposed in standard. The Aegis program, then entering service on USS Ticonderoga, was engineered around the assumption that the answer to the low-altitude saturation threat was more illuminators, faster reactions, and phased array radars, not a ramjet. Whether that was the right answer would not be tested for another 20 years. The domestic political consequence of the Falklands air defence lessons registered in Whitehall in a specific way. John Nott, the Defence Secretary whose 1981 review had proposed scrapping HMS Endurance and reducing the surface fleet by 1/3, left office in January 1983. His successor, Michael Heseltine, arrived at the MOD with a mandate from the Prime Minister to review the naval procurement programme in light of the war. The review, conducted through 1983 by a team under the Vice Chief of the Defence Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Peter Terry, was not published in full. Its principal conclusion, released in a statement on the defence estimates in May 1984, was that the surface fleet's air defence capability would be strengthened rather than reduced. The specific programme change was the acceleration of the Type 23 frigate, then in early design at the Ship Department at Bath, under Chief Naval Architect Peter Usher. The Type 23 had originally been conceived as a towed array anti-submarine warfare ship. The post-Falklands specification added a vertical launch Seawolf system, the GWS-26, which addressed the specific tactical problem that had cost HMS Coventry: the inability of the Type 42 to engage more than one low-altitude target simultaneously. The Type 23 would work in company with Type 42s as Broadsword had worked with Coventry, but with a Seawolf variant capable of engaging 4 targets at once. The industrial politics of the decision registered in Barrow, in Glasgow, and in the constituencies of MPs whose warship building yards depended on it. Yarrow Shipbuilders on the Clyde, whose managing director Robert Easton had lobbied through 1983 for the yard's inclusion in the Type 23 programme, secured the lead ship contract for HMS Norfolk in October 1984. Vickers at Barrow, whose workforce had launched every Type 42 hull, received subsequent orders. The Seawolf missile itself, produced by British Aerospace Dynamics at Stevenage under the direction of Technical Director Alan Bond, went into series production. At Downing Street, Margaret Thatcher took a personal interest in the Sea Dart lessons for a reason connected to the broader Cold War argument she was making. On October 8, 1982, at the Conservative Party conference in Brighton, she had told the Hall that the Falklands had shown that, when the demand rose to us, we did not fail it. The private version of the argument, made in Cabinet on the afternoon of July 22, 1982, and recorded in CAB 128/74, was more specific. The Prime Minister argued that the war had demonstrated the value of specialised British defence capabilities against Soviet-supplied systems, and that this had implications for the Trident procurement decision then before Cabinet. The Trident decision, taken in March 1982 before the Falklands and confirmed in July 1982 after, committed the United Kingdom to the American DE5 missile for a submarine-launched deterrent force to enter service in the mid-1990s. The Sea Dart evidence was used in Thatcher's argument to counter the criticism that Britain was becoming excessively dependent on American defence technology. Sea Dart, Type 42, and the Falklands showed, the argument ran, that British industry could still produce systems that outperformed American equivalents in specific operational contexts. Whether the argument was sound in strategic terms was debated at the time and has been debated since. Peter Hennessy, writing in The Secret State, has noted that the British defence industrial base of the 1980s was already narrowing under sustained treasury pressure, and that the Falklands performance of Sea Dart was in part the last dividend of investment decisions made in the 1960s. Lawrence Freedman, in his official history of the Falklands Campaign, is more cautious about drawing broad conclusions from single engagements. What is not in dispute is that the Royal Navy in 1984 and the MOD's export drive through the middle of the decade drew on Falklands data to argue for a specific proposition: that in the last decade of the Cold War, British area air defence at sea was operationally credible against a Soviet threat. The final phase of Sea Dart's Cold War service ran from 1985 to 1991. HMS Edinburgh and HMS York, the last two Batch 3 Type 42s, commissioned in 1985 and 1985 respectively, completing the class at 14 hulls. The Sea Dart Mod 2 upgrade, contracted to British Aerospace Dynamics in 1986, incorporated the lessons of the Farnborough and Marconi post-Falklands reports. The new Seeker head, designed by a team at Stevenage under Chief Engineer David Bignell, addressed low-altitude tracking against complex sea backgrounds and included the first British application of monopulse angle tracking to a naval missile seeker. The system's last Cold War operational test came in the Gulf in February 1991, when HMS Gloucester under Captain Philip Wilcox engaged and destroyed an Iraqi Silkworm anti-ship missile inbound on USS Missouri. The Silkworm and the Chinese-built HY-2, a derivative of the Soviet Styx that Sea Dart had been designed against, was hit at approximately 8 nautical miles range at low altitude by a single missile from Gloucester's aft launcher. The engagement was, according to the after-action report signed by Wilcox and forwarded through Vice Admiral Sir Peter Woodhead to the MOD, the first destruction of a hostile anti-ship missile in flight by a naval surface-to-air missile in combat. The American reaction this time was recorded on the bridge of Missouri by a US Navy captain who was heard to say that the British ship had just done what the American ship's phalanx system had been about to do. Whether that assessment was correct, phalanx would have engaged the Silkworm at approximately 1.5 miles, giving the fragments of the destroyed missile some possibility of continuing to hit Missouri, is a matter on which sources disagree. What is not disputed is that Sea Dart's engagement envelope in this instance was longer and gave more time. Admiral Sir Julian Oswald, First Sea Lord, wrote to the First Sea Lord's American counterpart, Admiral Frank Kelso, in March 1991, setting out the engagement in technical detail. The letter, held in the First Sea Lord's papers at the National Museum of the Royal Navy at Portsmouth, made a specific point. The missile that had killed the Silkworm had been designed 27 years earlier against a specific Soviet threat, and had been kept operationally relevant by successive upgrades justified in Treasury submissions on the basis of the Falklands data. The argument was, in effect, that British defence procurement, often criticised for slowness and cost overruns, had in this case produced a system that had earned its investment 3 times over. The Cold War ended 8 months later. The Soviet naval aviation regiments at Olenia and Kipolovo, whose backfires had been the notional targets for Sea Dart's original 1962 requirement, were reduced through 1992 and 1993 to a fraction of their strength. The Type 42s and their missiles remained in service. HMS Edinburgh, the last Type 42 to decommission, paid off in 2013. The engineering answer to the American question, why CDOT had done what Standard could not, had by then been absorbed into the Sea Viper system on the Type 45 destroyers, which entered service from 2009. The Aster 30 missile, developed by MBDA with British participation, uses vertical launch, active radar homing, and lateral thrust vectoring. It bears little external resemblance to Sea Dart. Internally, however, the operational assumptions it is designed to meet, multiple simultaneous low-altitude targets, dense electromagnetic environments, area defense over a task force, trace directly back to what the Type 42s learned in the South Atlantic in May and June 1982. The Ministry of Defense has never published a full account of the intelligence exchange with the Americans in 1982. Files at Kew continue to be released in fragments. What is on the record is that a British missile designed by a Yorkshire engineer against a Soviet bomber killed Argentine Skyhawks at an altitude no one had predicted and prompted questions the US Navy took a decade to answer.